The court will come to order. So said Judge John Ralston. It was Friday, July 10th, 1925, just a little more than 2 months after George Rapelier hatched his plan in Robinson's drugstore, and the trial began. It was hot in Dayton, Tennessee. It was really hot. Yale law professor and legal historian Akil Reed Amar says, if you want to know why our original Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, they were added later, the explanation in part is it was really hot in Philadelphia. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention had been there from May 25th to September 17th in 1787. They were tired and it was hot. Do not underestimate the effect of heat on the human mind and spirit, and thus on the administration of justice. Good morning. A quick housekeeping matter, a heads up. If I've got this right, there may well be time at the end this morning for some Q&A, so I give you that heads up in advance. Let's get into the courtroom. We're told that the courtroom had a legitimate seating capacity of 400 people. They managed to stuff about 700 people inside. What did it look like inside the courtroom? There is some brief, grainy, bad quality video, but I'd like you to take a look at it. Just 25 seconds worth. So here is Darrow on the left, Brian on the right, with the ever-present fans. This is the crowd gathered in this courtroom. It's a big courtroom, and it was packed. Here's Darrow speaking. The crowd, the audience listening, William Jennings Bryan on his feet in the courtroom. You can stop the share. So after Judge Ralston said the court will come to order, what do you think the judge said next? How about the prosecution may proceed with its case? No, don't be silly. The judge's next words were, Reverend Cartwright will open court with a prayer. Reverend Cartwright went on for about 5 or 6 minutes. I won't take our time to read you the entire text, but here's the flavor of it. O God, our divine Father, we approach unto thy province this morning. Thy province? I thought we were in the court's province. We trust, we come today with that degree of reverence that is due unto thy supreme majesty, O God. Grant that from the President of the United States down to the most insignificant officer thereof, that the affairs of church and state may be so administered that God may beget unto himself the greatest degree of honor and glory. I'm not sure what God may beget unto himself means. The pastor might as well have added, God help the agnostic or the atheist in this court. Now that the opening prayer was out of the way, time to actually get down to the trial, right? Not so fast. Scopes had been indicted in May. Remember, that was a special session of the grand jury because they didn't want to wait until the August session because some George Rapelier in another town was going to cook up the idea for a trial. But there was a question about the legality of the indictment from that grand jury because the grand jury's term had expired. So what to do? Well, you could wait for the next session of the grand jury to be impaneled to get another indictment. No way, no way. All the hotel rooms had been sold. The press was at hand. The courtroom was packed. The show must go on. So Judge Ralston impaneled a new grand jury right then and there. He tells the new grand jury that Scopes was indicted on May 25th, that there is some uncertainty about whether that indictment was valid. So he, the judge, had determined to convene this grand jury for the purpose of reinvestigating these charges. I'm not sure there's going to be a whole lot of investigating going on here. I mean, you tell the second investigator that the first investigator already saw fit to issue an indictment. Anyway, the judge reads the grand jury the charge he read to the first grand jury. Here's what the indictment said: that the law, quote, makes it unlawful to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man descended from a lower order of animals. Judge Ralston wasn't finished. Having read the indictment, what do you think he then read to the grand jury? Judge Ralston, quote, since the act involved in this investigation provides that it should be unlawful to teach any theory that denies the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, it is proper that I call your attention to the account of man's creation as taught in the Bible. He then reads the first chapter of Genesis, all 36 verses. So I thought I would dig right in. No, never mind. The judge then says, this statute only involves a misdemeanor, not a felony, but, quote, I regard a violation of this statute as a high misdemeanor because of the evil example of the teacher disregarding constituted authority in the very presence of the undeveloped mind whose thought and morals he directs and guides. After that, I'm surprised they didn't just take Scopes out and shoot him, right? Evil example, remember, the guy was playing tennis. They drag him into Robinson's drugstore. He says he probably didn't teach evolution. They say, oh, come on, can't you just say so? Remember, Scopes, what about it, right? And now this guy is an evil example. He disregarded constituted authority. I mean, whoever taught anything, it came from the textbook that the state had been using for 16 years that Doc Robinson had been selling out of his drugstore. What's going on here? This was a show trial, and everybody knew it. Historian Ed Larson says every major newspaper of the state, including those opposed to the Butler Act, criticized Dayton for staging the trial. The Chattanooga Times called the trial a publicity stunt. The Nashville Tennessean said Dayton was proceeding on the doubtful theory that it's good advertising to have people talking about you regardless of what they are saying. Congressman Foster Brown of Chattanooga said, it is not a fight for evolution or against evolution, but a fight against obscurity. But remember, Chattanooga, they had a little Dayton envy going on here, so maybe this was sour grapes. The congressman from Knoxville said the Dayton trial will be a travesty. Now, there is much that is interesting about this opening exercise. Like, what is the judge doing reading from the Bible? Leave that aside. We could ask a different question, which is, what Bible was he reading from? We'll get to that in a future lecture. But for now, I want to examine a different question. And to do so, I'm going to borrow liberally, steal from a friend of mine, Dr. Joel Hoffman. And from Joel's book, The Bible Doesn't Say That. Joel is a PhD linguist with a special interest in problems problems and myths of translation from Hebrew in religious texts, particularly the Bible. For fun, every once in a while, Joel and I correspond about interesting issues of translation and biblical interpretation or rules of evidence. This is just for fun. Joel writes that we all know that the Bible says God created the world in 6 days. It goes something like this. And believe me, I know I am talking to a group where there are some who know this stuff better than I, but I'm undaunted. God created the world in 6 days, the heaven and the earth the first day, along with light and darkness, sky and water on the second day, continents and plants on the third, so on, humans on the 6th day. Joel says we also know the Bible story about Eve being created from Adam's rib. If we throw in the desk set and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, we have a full-fledged retrospective on the work of Spencer Tracy. What about Adam's rib? Now, follow along. It comes from Genesis 2, verses 21 and 22. But by Genesis 2, Adam and Eve had already been created. God created male and female in his image in Genesis 1, verse 27. More confusion. Genesis 2, verse 2 says, God finished all the work that he had done. The woman created from Adam's rib had been created several verses earlier. What's going on? More confusion. Genesis 1, verse 27. Male and female people had already been created in 1:27. God completed the work in Genesis 2, verse 2. But Genesis 2, verse 18, the sole man of the earth was still alone, which is why God had to form every animal in Genesis 2, verse 19. Joel says it was in this context of a single male human with only animals around that God created woman from Adam's rib in this part of the creation story. So to recap, 6 days to create the world, animals, then man and woman, then God rests. After God rests, man is alone with no women and no animals, so God creates animals. Man's lonely, so God creates woman. If God rested after creating animals, then man, then woman, how could man be alone with no women and animals after God rested? How can this be explained? What does Dr. Hoffman have to say? He says the first creation story is the more familiar story. God creates in 6 days, rests on the seventh. The second story, man comes first, then animals, then Eve from Adam's rib. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible actually captions the first story, 6 days of creation and the Sabbath, and the second, another account of the creation. Now, another account, Joel says, suggests it's the same creation, only one sequence of events. Let's see what Dr. Hoffman says. He says, it doesn't take too careful a reading to suggest that there are two separate stories, not two accounts of the same story. The differences are too striking. There's no vegetation on the earth in Genesis 2, verse 5, even though plants were created in Genesis 1, verses 11 and 12. Adam is specifically alone without any animals in Genesis 2, verse 18, even though Genesis 1 is equally clear that the animals were all created before Adam. Joel published his book before I taught this course for the first time in 2019, which gives me all the more pleasure to report that he specifically notes in his book, this very point was raised by the defense in the Scopes monkey trial. The defense noted that there are two accounts in Genesis of the creation of man. They are not identical and at points differ widely. It would be difficult to say which is the teaching of the Bible. Well, if it's difficult to say which is the teaching of the Bible, how does somebody know when they have violated this criminal statute? What about that point? And on that, Judge Ralston said, nothing. So now the grand jury has heard the text of the Butler Act in the proposed indictment, and they heard a reading of one part of Genesis that may or may not be pertinent. What else would the grand jury need to know? Well, Scopes supposedly taught something in violation of the Butler Act. How is the grand jury supposed to know what Scopes supposedly taught? The prosecutors wanted 3 students of Scopes to say that he had taught evolution. These are 14-year-old boys. They did not want to get their teacher in trouble, so they head off into the woods. Someone had to go find them. Who do you think? Of course, John Scopes, our hero, went out and found the 3 students and persuaded them to testify to ensure that he would be indicted. And remember Scopes' account that I shared with you last week of preparing these students in the back of Stumpy Reed's cab. I think this is only fitting, since Scopes was the guy who went out and found the guy who served him with the warrant of his arrest. Scopes is a full-service defendant. So Scopes gets his students, they testify before the grand jury, and at 11 o'clock, the grand jury did what everyone needed the grand jury to do. Everyone, the prosecutors, the defense, the judge, the press, the town of Dayton. The grand jury indicted or re-indicted Scopes. Okay. Now the case can go forward. What do we have to do first? We have to pick a jury. You're probably familiar with the basics of this. It's done differently in different places, but there's a process known as voir dire. You know, in French, to see, to speak comes from the Latin originally. Verum dicere, that's for my Latin teacher. And in many courts, judges question the prospective jurors because when you let lawyers do it, it turns into show business, okay? Lawyers like to do voir dire because it gives you a moment of connection with the people who are going to be sitting in judgment of your case. Right? You get to look at a prospective juror and say, Mr. Smith, I assume that there's no reason that you couldn't give a fair and impartial judgment in this case. Right? Now, every once in a while, Mr. Smith says, well, no, actually, I hate all bankers, landlords, lawyers, judges, right? And Smith isn't going to wind up on the jury. But ordinarily, yes, I know, I'm sure I could render a fair and impartial verdict. What does it mean? It generally means nothing. But trial lawyers think that that 1 minute of personal connection to a prospective juror may, in the long run, pay off when the jury goes to deliberate about the case. Whatever. Now, to pick the jury, you have to have a jury pool, and courts have different ways of assembling people for the jury pool. Here, to pick the jury, Judge Ralston decided to select a townsman for the high honor of picking names out of the hat. Who does he bestow this honor on? A distinguished Dayton citizen named Thomas Jefferson Brewer. From the name alone, you knew that this guy was reared for greatness. Let's take a look at Thomas Jefferson Brewer. That's right. 4-year-old Tommy Brewer. Tommy Brewer lived across the street from the courthouse. Now, I mentioned, I think last week, that a couple of weeks ago I spent 3 days in Dayton. And I had a contact there, a wonderful guy named Tom Davis. He's part of the Ray County Historical Commission. Tom is steeped in this stuff. After we had lunch, I said, look, do you have a few minutes? Could we get in your car? Can you just drive me around to some of the places? Can we see where Robinson's drugstore was? It's no longer there. Can we go to the hotel where they had the dinners for Darrow and Brian? So we're driving around. At one point, Tom says, there's the house where Tommy Brewer lived. And on reflection, I'm not sure what is more strange, that Tom was pointing out to me the house where this 4-year-old kid lived, or that I thought it was really cool to get to see the house where Tommy Brewer lived. So Tommy Brewer was up there. The judge had asked his parents if he could come over. He sat on Judge Ralston's bench. He drew 20 names out of a hat. He was given $1. The judge has a 4-year-old drawing names out of a hat. What kind of trial was this? It was the kind of trial that happens when the judge is up for re-election the following year. We can stop the share. The first prospective juror was W.F. Roberson. Judge, have you formed or expressed an opinion as to the guilt or innocence of this defendant, John T. Scopes? Roberson, well, to some extent, Judge. Judge, what do you base that opinion on, Mr. Roberson? Roberson, rumor. Judge, from some witness, information from some witness, some of them who profess to know? Roberson, no, sir. Judge, general rumor? Roberson, yes, sir. Judge, I think he's a competent juror. The state says, we'll take him. Darrow asks, are you satisfied that you could try the case with perfect fairness to both sides? Roberson, yes, sir, I think I could. Darrow says, he's fine. The third prospective juror was Jim Riley. White shirt, dark blue glasses. Now here we get our first glimpse of Darrow, the trial lawyer who knew what he was doing in a courtroom. He asks Mr. Riley, have you ever heard Mr. Bryan speak about evolution? Riley, no, sir. Darrow, ever read anything he said about it? Riley, no, sir. I can't read. Darrow, well, you are fortunate. Now, Darrow's playing to a larger audience here, right? Maybe to Mr. Riley to see if he can get a laugh, maybe to the spectators, right? But Darrow's, this is the common touch of Clarence Darrow, who doesn't take himself too seriously, or at least plays that role. Darrow then asks this guy, remember he said he couldn't read, is it your dark blue glasses? Riley says, no, I am uneducated. So this process goes on for a while. There was a preacher who had served 4 different churches who tried to get on the jury, But he lost out when he admitted to Darrow that he had an opinion on evolution. Quote, I preached against it, of course. Juror after juror, Darrow's asking what they do for a living. Do they have any thoughts about evolution? Would they be capable of being fair and impartial? In a normal trial, that question, of course, is more probative than any answer. It's just Darrow trying to wend his way into the juror's conscience. Now, there's an interesting question to be raised about this, which is he trying for an acquittal or a conviction because they wanted this case to go up on appeal? Let's share the screen, please. Before the end of the day, they had picked a jury. And the picture you're about to see, by my count, it looks like these are 11 jurors plus Judge Ralston. Judge Ralston is on the right-hand side with the hat in his hand. And I'm thinking these are 11 jurors because off to the left, I think I recognize this picture as being the courtroom bailiff. So, the jury, 9 farmers. 5 had lived in Ray County since birth. Beyond Mr. Riley, who couldn't read, 3 of them testified they had read no books other than the Bible. The author, Ray Ginger, commented, these were men who had compensated for the narrowness of their own experience by ignoring the experience of others. 6 Baptists, 4 Methodists, and 1 disciple of Christ, 1 who didn't belong to a church. Scopes said that he knew all the jurors by sight, if not by name. In his memoirs, he wrote, it is safe to assume that I had an excellent chance of being convicted. We can stop the share. There had been discussion about whether the trial would resume the next day on Saturday, but Judge Ralston said, that's enough for now. We'll continue on Monday morning. That was the end of the first day of the trial, that Friday. What happened between Friday, close of business, and Monday at 9 a.m.? Plenty. Now, I will spare you the long story of the negotiations between the 2 teams of lawyer on a question that may seem relatively unimportant. When should Judge Ralston address the question of whether the defense's team of scientific expert witnesses should be permitted to testify? The defense had a bunch of science experts ready to roll. They were in Dayton and they were not getting paid. The defense wanted this issue addressed immediately. If they weren't going to get to testify, they wanted to let them all go home. So there was back and forth about whether the judge would address this right up front or wait until later in the trial. The lawyers agreed, then they disagreed, and one thing led to another. And eventually the defense agreed, all right, we'll wait, we'll present this argument to the judge later in the trial. It sounds inconsequential, except that decision had ramifications for what became the most famous scene in the trial, but that's for lecture number 4. So what's happening this Saturday? The defense lawyers were preparing, they're working with their various scientific expert witnesses, and with the lawyers, we can go to the next slide, with the lawyers was a Rabbi Herman Rosenwasser of San Francisco. This is a picture of the defense team. They were gathered up at a place called the Mansion. It was a nice house in Dayton, and the defense were hanging out there. And so with the lawyers is Rabbi Herman Rosenwasser, and you can see Rabbi Rosenwasser right here. So naturally, involvement of the clergy in this case is worthy of interest, and I'll mention a few clergy at various times. But I had, shall we say, a personal interest in whether there were any rabbis involved. And it turns out that Rosenwasser was not the only rabbi with some connection to the trial, but Rosenwasser attempted to play a unique role, so he's worthy of a brief discussion here. Herman Rosenwasser was born in Hungary. He was 46 at the time of the Scopes trial. I haven't found anything that explains how he came to the U.S. We do know that he received a Master of Arts degree from Western Reserve University, now part of Case Western, and he was ordained by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1908. The Hebrew Union College is the Reform Rabbinic Seminary. Rabbi Rosenwasser was the rabbi of a major congregation, Ohavai Shalom, one of the four leading congregations in San Francisco from the 1860s through the 1920s. It lost its synagogue building during the Depression. It dissolved in 1940. So don't bother asking your San Francisco friends if they know about Rabbi Rosenwasser. It's unlikely. It was a Reform congregation by the late 19th century. Rabbi Rosenwasser was a student of language. He was a fluent speaker of English, German, Yiddish, Hungarian, and Hebrew. He could read or translate Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Chaldaic. Chaldaic. I looked it up. A form of Aramaic. Hebrews, Canaanites, and Phoenicians spoke it at the time of Daniel the prophet, and when Jesus was alive, it became the foundation of Arabic and Hebrew. Rabbi Rosenwasser's premise was that to understand the Bible, one must know Hebrew. The King James Version of the Bible was made in 1611, but the scientific study of Hebrew did not begin until 1753. Thus, so said Rabbi Rosenwasser, much of the King James translation is inaccurate. He says, I'm in no position to second guess, but he says the Hebrew word bara, translated as create, actually means to set in motion. Adam actually means any living organism containing blood. So according to Rabbi Rosenwasser, the statement that we are descended from Adam could mean that we are descended from lower orders of animals. The author Ray Ginger says, Rosenwasser, he's with the defense team, he had brought a Hebrew copy of Genesis. He would translate the Hebrew into German with maybe a half dozen German words for each Hebrew word. Then, according to Ginger, he would pick and choose again to turn German into English. Ginger says, the transmutations were startling. For example, one passage from Psalms, he hath made a decree which shall not pass, became, he hath made a law of nature which he doth not transgress. I had a brief back and forth with my friend Dr. Hoffman about this, and Joel's conclusion, which made sense to me, was at a certain point, he who doeth the translating can maketh it say whatever he doth want. But regardless of the particular merits of Rabbi Rosenwasser's take on the translation, the defense lawyers were onto something, that the state presumably had to prove that teaching evolution actually did contradict something in the Bible. What else was going on in Dayton over this weekend after the Friday first day of trial and Monday when things would resume? Next slide, please. Charles Francis Potter was a Unitarian minister from New York who was associated with the defense team. He was invited to speak Sunday morning at the local First Methodist Church North. Several parishioners objected to their pastor, Reverend Howard Byrd. Reverend Byrd, you may recall, he's the modernist preacher whose teaching encouraged George Rapelier that evolution and Christianity were not incompatible. So Reverend Potter, based on these objections, decides not to speak, and the pastor Byrd resigned his pulpit. Now you have to know that if there was a Methodist Church North, naturally Dayton had a Methodist Church South. And who do you know was preaching at the Methodist Church South that Sunday morning? That's right, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan's talk, that God must have had a reason for making man ignorant rather than learned. In passing on men's qualifications for heaven, God does not ask for diplomas. Bryan couples some references to heaven with references to Florida, for whom he was shilling for its real estate business. Let's move on to Monday, July 13th, 1925, day 2 of the trial. We are back in the courtroom where it is hot. We're told that jurors had handheld fans with an ad for a toothpaste company, "Do your gums bleed?" Next, slide 7. The radio engineers had to fix the hookup. We're told that Judge Ralston said, "My gavel will be heard around the world." Next to slide 8. Let me quickly introduce the prosecution team. Tom Stewart was the Attorney General of Tennessee for this district. Others on the prosecution team were Ben McKenzie, his son Gordon McKenzie, Sue Hicks, and his brother Herbert Hicks. After the opening prayer, Tom Stewart of the prosecution read the indictment to the jury. Again, I'm sorry, it would have been read to the grand jury, so now it's being read to the jury. We can stop the share. Then for the defense, John Neal stood up and argued a motion to quash the indictment. This is actually the guts of the case. You may recall last week I said, juries decide factual disputes. There wasn't any real factual dispute here. This was all about whether this law was constitutional. And John Neal stood up to argue that the Butler Act violated the Tennessee state constitution. Why the state constitution? If time permits at the end, I'll give you a few minutes more. So John Neal is arguing this purely legal issue, and he says the state constitution requires the state to, quote, cherish science and literature. He says, in no possible way can science be taught without bringing in the doctrine of evolution. He says, then we come to the most sacred provision of the Constitution of Tennessee. No preference shall be given to any religious establishment. And he says, we don't say that the state can't supervise and control its schools, but that control is limited by this constitutional boundary. He says also the Butler Act violated part of the state constitution regarding the expression of opinion. That's the free speech argument that the ACLU liked. At this point, Tom Stewart says, if he's going to go on with this, we should excuse the jury. Juries are not usually in the courtroom for legal argument. They're there to hear witnesses about factual stuff. Clarence Darrow objects. Stewart again asks the judge to excuse the jury. There's back and forth among the lawyers. Then the judge says, the court will be more at ease with the jury not present. Darrow says, we'll be less at ease. Okay? The jury is out. John Neal continues, this law puts at issue a doctrine, the story of creation in the Bible, that's so indefinite that every man that reads the Bible will have a different interpretation as to exactly what that theory of creation is and how it's possible for the state of Tennessee to make a crime where every individual would arrive at a different idea as to exactly what the offense is. You have just as many interpretations of the particular offense as there are individuals who read the Bible. Then Arthur Garfield Hayes, for the defense, makes a different kind of argument. He says, I have taken the liberty of drafting a law which it seems to me would be constitutional if this law, the Butler Act, is constitutional. In the tradition of great satire, Arthur Garfield Hayes proposes the death penalty for anyone teaching in public schools any theory that denies the biblical story that the earth is the center of the universe and who teaches instead that the earth and planets revolve around the sun. Hayes had struck a nerve. He knew the pen is mightier than the sword, or in this case, mightier than a straight-on legal argument. And we know he had hit a nerve because Ben McKenzie of the prosecution team got a bit hot. And Ben McKenzie said, there's no such act as that has ever passed through the fertile brain of a Tennessean. I don't know what they do up in his country. Up, of course, is the North. If these gentlemen have any laws in the great metropolitan city of New York that conflict with the Butler Act, or in the great white city of the Northwest, that's Chicago, that's Clarence Darrow, that will throw any light on this, we will be glad to hear about it. Dudley Field Malone. Again, we got different defense lawyers jumping up. This is not how a real trial goes. Malone says, though I do not mean to interrupt the gentleman, that means an interruption is coming, I do not consider further allusion to geographical parts of the country as particularly necessary, such as reference to New Yorkers and to citizens of Illinois. The judge, Colonel Malone, everybody has a title, right? Colonel Malone, you do not know General Mackenzie as well as the court does. Everything he says is in good humor. You are our guests, and we accord you the same privileges and rights and courtesies that we do any other lawyer. Malone, we appreciate the hospitality of the court and the people of Tennessee, but, quote, we are here as lawyers, not as guests. There's then back and forth about the police power of the state of Tennessee to spend its money on its schools and do in its schools as it deems fit. Sue Hicks for the prosecution, responding to the defense argument about freedom of religion. He says, it's perfectly ridiculous to me to think that when the state employs that teacher, that the teacher can go in and teach any kind of doctrine he wants to teach. Suppose a teacher wanted to teach architecture in a school when he's been employed to teach mathematics. Suppose he's employed to teach arithmetic to the class, which the Uniform Textbook Commission has adopted. And by the way, the Uniform Textbook Commission has been established by the legislature. My 2 cents. Teaching architecture instead of arithmetic is not the analogy. Teaching biology without evolution is like teaching architecture without the laws of physics and engineering. And let's just remember where that textbook came from, authorized by the state of Tennessee, sold by Doc Robinson. These arguments of law continue on into Monday afternoon. General Tom Stewart is talking about why the Tennessee constitutional provision to cherish literature and science is not violated by the Butler Act. John Neal, I gather he admits it would be impossible to cherish science under this law. Stewart, no, sir, I do not make any such admission, claiming that I do not come from a monkey. Malone, we did not think you did either, General. Stewart goes on arguing that the Butler Act does not interfere with worship or preferring one religion to another. Darrow picks up on this. This is his ballpark. He says that's the part of the Constitution that's offended by the Butler Act, about preferring a religious establishment. Stewart says, in what ways? Darrow, giving preference to the Bible. Stewart, to the Bible? Darrow, yes. Why not the Koran? Stewart, might as well give it to any other book? Darrow, certainly. Stewart, and no preference shall ever be given by law to any religious establishment or mode of worship? Darrow, certainly. Stewart, the St. James Version of the Bible is the recognized one in this section of the country. Pause right there. There is so much in that short sentence, and all of it is wrong. The St. James Version of the Bible. So now we're talking about a particular version of the Bible, as opposed to other versions of the Bible. Other versions, other words, other translations, other interpretations. You get the picture, right? Is the recognized one. Recognized by whom? In this section of the country, do different parts of Tennessee recognize different versions? Would the Butler Act apply differently in different counties of the state? Tom Stewart, the laws of the land recognize the Bible. The laws of the land recognize the law of God and Christianity as part of the common law. What laws of the land is he talking about? Again, now, as at other times in the trial, this smacks more of a debate than a trial. Malone asks if the law did not prefer the Bible to the Koran. Stewart, it doesn't mention the Koran. Malone, does not it prefer the Bible to the Koran? Stewart, we are not living in a heathen country. Malone, will you answer my question? Does it not prefer the Bible to the Koran? Stewart, we are not living in a heathen country, so how could it prefer the Bible to the Koran? Stewart goes on, do you say teaching the Bible in the public school is a religious matter? Malone, no, I would say to base a theory set forth in any version of the Bible to be taught in the public school is an invasion of the rights of the citizen, whether exercised by the police power or by the legislature. Who cares what these lawyers said about this stuff 100 years ago? And the answer is, I encourage all of us to care about it because it's not all that different from a lot of things we hear 100 years later. Later that afternoon, Stewart is talking more about the power of the state to regulate this stuff. Arthur Garfield Hayes says, did the state, under the power you have referred to, prescribe the book which Mr. Scopes taught from? Remember from Robinson's drugstore. Stewart, there is no act on that as I understand it. Hayes, I thought you just stated that the state prescribed the school books. Did they prescribe the school books that Mr. Scopes was using? Stewart, I said they had a right to. Hayes, did they exercise that right? Malone chimes in. How did he get the book? Was it given to him by the state? Stewart, that is a matter of proof. We are prepared to show that. Do you want to put me on the witness stand? Malone, no, I would like to. The transcript then has in brackets, laughter in the courtroom. One lawyer putting an opposing lawyer on the witness stand. Yeah, that's funny. Stay tuned. Then there's a recess, and then Clarence Darrow spoke. I'm going to quote from Darrow at some length. I'm going to do it because the man knew how to use the language, because I believe he thought he was speaking not only to the judge, sometimes to the jury, but also to the people of Dayton, to the people of the United States. Remember, this was being broadcast on radio. Because most of us came to know about this trial from the exalted language crafted by two playwrights and then a screenwriter, but the eloquence did not begin with them. I'm going to quote him at length because these words sing to me, and perhaps they do to some of you. Darrow started by saying he'd been treated with courtesy by the opposing lawyers and the community. I shall always remember that this court is the first one that ever gave me the great title of colonel, and I hope it will stick to me when I get back north. Judge, I want you to take it back to your home with you, Colonel. Now, there's no reference in the transcript to laughter, so it's hard to know whether the judge said it graciously or as a dig. Darrow, this case we have to argue is a case at law. And hard as it is for me to bring my mind to conceive it, almost impossible as it is to put my mind back into the 16th century, I am going to argue it as if it was serious, as if it was a death struggle between two civilizations. We have been informed that the legislature has the right to prescribe the course of conduct in the public schools. Within reason, they no doubt have it. He goes on to say he didn't think the legislature could eliminate math, geography, and writing and to teach only religion. Quote, for instance, suppose the legislature should say, we think the religious privileges and duties of the citizens of Tennessee are much more important than education. We agree with the distinguished governor of the state. If religion must go or learning must go, why, let learning go. Quote, I do not know how much it would have to go, but let it go, and therefore we will establish a course in the public schools of teaching that the Christian religion, as unfolded in the Bible, is true, and that every other religion or system of ethics is false. And to carry that out, no person in the public school shall be permitted to read or hear anything except Genesis. Darrow says, would that be constitutional? He says, if it is, the Constitution is a lie and a snare, and the people have forgot what liberty means. And he quotes the historian Bancroft. It's all right to preserve freedom in constitutions, but when the spirit of freedom has fled from the hearts of the people, then its matter is equally sacrificed under law. And so it is, unless there is left enough of the spirit of freedom in the state of Tennessee and in the United States, there is not a single line of any constitution that can withstand bigotry and ignorance when it seeks to destroy the rights of the individual, and bigotry and ignorance are ever active. Here we find today as brazen and as bold an attempt to destroy learning as was ever made in the Middle Ages. And the only difference is we have not provided that they shall be burned at the stake. But there is time for that, Your Honor. We have to approach these things gradually. Stop the share. This is Clarence Darrow in his greatness. It's great rhetoric. It's also serious constitutional theory. Back to Yale law professor Akhil Amar. One of his books is America's Unwritten Constitution. Let me say America's Unwritten Constitution, the precedents and principles we live by. And his thesis is that our constitutional regime encompasses values and protections beyond what the founders could possibly have put in the written document, where they were sweltering in the Philadelphia heat. So just one example of many, one person, one vote. That's not in the Constitution. It's an unwritten rule. that was adopted by the U.S. Supreme Court. So Professor Amar and many, many others say that since the written Constitution doesn't come with a complete set of instructions about how to construe it, we must go beyond the text to make sense of the text. Darrow is tapping into the same vein. If we strip the document of the implied spirit that motivates it, the words alone cannot save us. Right? Then Darrow gets into one of his real arguments. Can Your Honor tell us what is given as the origin of man as shown in the Bible? Is there any human being can tell us? There are two conflicting accounts in the first two chapters, as we discussed. It does not specify, the law does not specify what you cannot teach, but it says you cannot teach anything that conflicts with the Bible. Then just imagine making it a crime that is so uncertain and impossible that every man must be sure that he has read everything in the Bible, and not only read it, but understood it, or he might violate the criminal code. Who is the chief mogul that can tell us what the Bible means? He goes on, there are in America at least 500 different sects or churches, all of which quarrel with each other and the importance or unimportance of certain things and the construction of certain passages. All along the line, they do not agree among themselves and they cannot agree among themselves. They never have and probably never will. There is a great division between the Catholics and the Protestants. There is such a disagreement that my client, who's a school teacher, not only must know the subject he is teaching, but he must know everything about the Bible in reference to evolution. And he must be sure that he expresses his right, or else some fellow will come along, more ignorant perhaps than he, and say, you have made a bad guess, and I think you have committed a crime. Darrow went on. My friend, the Attorney General, Tom Stewart, says that John Scopes knows what he is here for. Yes, I know what he is here for, because the fundamentalists are after everybody that thinks. I know why he is here. I know he is here because ignorance and bigotry are rampant, and it is a mighty strong combination, Your Honor. It makes me fearful. He goes on to talk about the state and what kind of restrictions they can impose in a curriculum. He says, along comes somebody who says, we've got to believe it as I believe it. It's a crime to know more than I know. And they publish a law to inhibit learning. It makes the Bible the yardstick to measure every man's intellect, to measure every man's intelligence, and to measure every man's learning. Now Darrow is rolling. Are your mathematics good? Turn to Elijah 1 verse 2. Is your philosophy good? See 2 Samuel verse 3. Is your astronomy good? See Genesis chapter 2 verse 7. Is your chemistry? See Deuteronomy. He's just making stuff up, right? He's making up sites. But it works. The Inherit the Wind screenwriter liked it and stole it. Darrow, I will tell you what's going to happen, and I do not pretend to be a prophet. This is a dig at Brian, who was known as the prophet from Nebraska. But I don't need to be a prophet to know. Judge, sorry to interrupt your argument, but it's time to adjourn. Darrow says, can I continue for just 5 minutes, or I'll close in the morning? And Judge says, why don't you proceed tomorrow? Whereupon Darrow keeps talking. And to show that he really had some gas left in his tank at the end of the court day, he made the remarks that I began the course with. You may recall, he said, if today you can take a thing like evolution, make it a crime to teach it in the public school, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, et cetera, et cetera. And remember, after a while, Your Honor, it's the setting of man against man and creed against creed, until with flying banners and beating drums, we're marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots lighted faggots to burn the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. Let me quickly note, you notice the phrase toward the end, when bigots lighted faggots to burn the men who dared bring any intelligence. When I read that in the transcript, I was confused. I was only familiar with that term as a gay slur. How is it being used here? I looked it up. Perhaps many of you already know, a bundle of sticks or twigs or branches bound together and used as fuel or a torch. So if any of you happen to remember, when I read it last week, I did not include the word faggots when I read it last week. I didn't want it to be a possible distraction, but there you have it. So that was the end of day 2. The author, Ray Ginger, says, Darrow's speech had quite an impact on at least some people. He says a Dayton native came up to Darrow and said, if I could have heard you before, I never would have spoken of you as I have in the past. Darrow told him, it's okay. Ben McKenzie of the prosecution team said, Ginger says, in a voice choked truly or falsely with emotion, it was the greatest speech I ever heard in my life on any subject. Ray Ginger said Darrow was beginning to have an impact on the people of Dayton. He says, it was not easy to remain hostile to a man as winsome and tolerant as Darrow proved to be. Now listen to what the journalist H.L. Mencken said. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mencken, at least by reputation, the great cynic. There were many journalists there, but what Mencken wrote, perhaps because he was as acerbic as could be, much of his stuff is what made an impact on the public and is remembered. Mencken wrote, the net effect of Clarence Darrow's great speech yesterday seems to be precisely the same as if he had balled it up a rain spout in the interior of Afghanistan. The very judge on the bench toward the end of it began to look uneasy, but the morons in the audience, when it was over, simply hissed it. The town whisper is that the local attorney general, Tom Stewart, is not a fundamentalist and hence has no stomach for this job. It seems not improbable. He is a man of evident education, and his argument yesterday was confined very strictly to the constitutional points, the argument of a competent and conscientious lawyer, and to me, at least, very persuasive. Stewart, after all, is a foreigner here, almost as much so as Darrow or Hayes or Malone. He's doing his job, and that's all. The real animus of the prosecution centers in Bryan. He is the plaintiff and the prosecutor. The local lawyers are simply bottle holders for him. Mencken says, I have met no educated man in the state who is not ashamed of the ridicule that has fallen upon the state, and I have met none, except for John Neal, who had the courage to speak out while it was yet time. If the state is to be saved at all, it must be saved by the courts. For one, I have little hope of relief in that direction, despite Hayes's logic and Darrow's eloquence. Constitutions in America no longer mean what they say. To mention the Bill of Rights is to be damned as a red. Mencken, too, is invoking our unwritten Constitution. We return to the courtroom for day 3 of the trial, Tuesday, July 14th. We begin with Judge Ralston calling a Reverend Stribling to open with a prayer. And now Clarence Darrow objects. The judge says, I am responsible for the conduct of the court. It's been my custom since I've been a judge to have prayers in the courtroom when it was convenient, and I know of no reason why I should not follow up this custom. So I will overrule the objection. Darrow wasn't finished. He keeps objecting. Tom Stewart responds. He says, the state makes no contention that there is a conflict between science and religion. It is a case involving the fact as to whether or not a school teacher has taught a doctrine prohibited by statute. And we, for the state, think it's quite proper to open the court with prayer if the court sees fit to do so. And such an idea extended by the agnostic counsel for the defense is foreign to the thoughts and ideas of the people who do not know anything about infidelity and care less. The state makes no contention that there is a conflict between science and religion. Really? Agnostic counsel for the defense. Then when he said such an idea is foreign to the thoughts and ideas of the people who do not know anything about infidelity and care less, you got me on that. I don't know what he's talking about. Arthur Garfield Hayes. May I ask to enter an objection to the statement, agnostic counsel for the defense? Dudley Field Malone chimes in. Your Honor has the discretion to have a prayer or not have a prayer. I can assure the court when we, the defense team, talked it over among ourselves as colleagues, there was no objection felt to the opening of these proceedings by prayer the first day. I don't buy that for a minute. I don't buy that. Malone then asks the judge whether in other trials the judge has opened every day with a prayer. He says, because the prayers we've already heard, having been duly argumentative, that they help to increase the atmosphere of hostility to our point of view, which already exists in the community by widespread propaganda. Tom Stewart responds, there's no question about what Scopes did. So, quote, so far as creating an atmosphere of hostility is concerned, I would advise Mr. Malone that this is a God-fearing country. Malone says, and it is no more God-fearing country than that from which I came. The judge says, I have discretion, I invoke divine guidance, and I overrule the objection. Whereupon Reverend Stribling delivers the prayer. He goes on for 3 paragraphs, including asking God to give unto us minds that are willing to be directed in the way thou wouldst have us do. And may there be in every heart and in every mind a reverence to the great creator of the world. He concludes by asking for it in the name of our blessed Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Yes, I would say the objection was overruled. The judge says he needs more time to consider the motion that the defense had filed, remember, to quash the indictment, to throw out the case. So they adjourn court. They come back at 2:30. Now get ready for one of the mini dramas of the trial. Judge Ralston comes back on the bench and he says that he gave strict instructions to his stenographer that the judge's opinion on the pending motion to dismiss the case was not to be released to any person. Quote, if any member of the press has any intimation as to what my opinion is, no person knows except myself and the stenographer. If any person sends it out before I begin to read it, I will deal with them for contempt of court. So an hour and a half later, the court is called to order. And now we move on to, or I should say move back to another issue. Arthur Garfield Hayes presents a petition. It's going to lead to a different kind of entertainment. Arthur Garfield Hayes starts to speak, and he's presenting a petition from representatives of religious organizations, churches, and synagogues, quote, that if you, judge, continue your custom of opening the daily session of Ray County with a prayer. He starts to talk when Tom Stewart says, Your Honor has ruled on this. And Hayes says, I insist on making my motion. Stewart says, I am making my objection to the court. Will you please keep your mouth shut? Judge says, I will hear the motion. Tom Stewart, I object to it with all the vehemence of my nature. Arthur Garfield Hayes, he says, there are many to whom the prayers of the fundamentalists are not spiritually uplifting and are occasionally offensive. It seems to us only just and right that we should occasionally hear a prayer which requires no mental reservations on our part and in which we can conscientiously participate. That's what the petition asks for, that the judge should alternate in his selection of pastors doing the opening prayers between fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists. So Judge Ralston says, I shall refer this petition to the Pastors Association of the town. And the transcript of the trial says, laughter and loud applause and rapping for order by the policemen. Question, why are they laughing? Why were they applauding? Were they laughing at the judge? Were they laughing at Arthur Garfield Hayes and the way the judge was dismissive of the petition? Ray Ginger says at first the press thought the judge was making a joke. Then they realized this was his way of trying to be impartial. So the judge finished. He said, I'll ask the Pastors Association to name the man who does the daily prayer, because I, Judge Ralston, will stay out of the pastor selection process. This is Judge Ralston's idea of separation of church and state. Okay? John Neal says, well, Your Honor knows that the men who you're going to refer this motion to are not among the class of men who signed the petition. The Pastors Association is a different group from the people who signed the petition. Judge, I see by the press one minister has resigned his post recently because Dr. Potter was not allowed to preach in his church. And I take it he's in sympathy with Dr. Potter and his doctrine. So the others in the Pastors Association who signed the petition, perhaps they are fundamentalists. I don't know. The guys who signed the petition saying appoint some non-fundamentalists, perhaps they're fundamentalists, a Congregationalist, 2 Unitarians, and a Reformed Jew? I don't think so. Was the judge having some fun or just ignorant? Who filed this petition? A bunch of people. There was a Reverend Potter of the Unitarian Church in New York. There was a Reverend Hagan from West Virginia, but he's a Yale alum. And then there's another Unitarian minister. And then Rabbi Jerome Mark of Temple Beth El in Knoxville, Tennessee. Let's share the screen, please. So I couldn't help myself. Who's the rabbi who showed up on the petition in the Scopes case? A quick side note. 6 years ago, when I did the original research for the class, I decided the way to figure out about Rabbi Mark was to play a quick game of what we would call Jewish geography. I Googled Temple Beth El in Knoxville. It still exists. The then rabbi is the brother of a friend of mine. I email the rabbi and tell him what I'm up to. Is there anybody around in the congregation who's got any stories to tell about Rabbi Mark? Yes, he has a grandson who is a current member of the congregation. He has a granddaughter who lives in Northern Virginia. This was just too easy, right? Rabbi Jerome Mark was ordained as a Reformed rabbi in Cincinnati in June 1918. He had several small congregations throughout the South. Congregation Bethel of Knoxville reports that Rabbi Mark became their first resident rabbi in 1922. They said that he left in 1926 to take a pulpit in Selma, Alabama. Why did Rabbi Marks leave the congregation in Knoxville? What happened between 1922 and 1926? That's right, 1925 in Dayton happened. I want to share with you some of what his granddaughter Roz Shanzer reported to me. We had an email exchange. She said, my grandfather was a rabbi in Knoxville 2 different times, and the trial in 1925 occurred during his first posting there when he was 24 years old. He had wanted to speak to his congregation about the trial, but the board of directors at Temple Bethel absolutely forbade it because they were afraid his sermon would infuriate the Ku Klux Klan and other anti-Jewish elements in Knoxville. He argued that the board didn't even know what he planned to say, but they didn't care. So he quit. And he went to Selma, Alabama, and then he became the first Reformed rabbi in the Southern Hemisphere in Sydney, Australia, no less. Roz sent me an 8-page letter typed by her grandfather. It focused largely on the lawyers and the judge and the hubbub surrounding the trial. It was a letter that he dated in April 1959. So this is 34 years after the trial. It's entitled Reminiscences of Scopes' Trial. Rabbi Mark said that he attended the trial as an interested onlooker. He got to Dayton. He joined the crowd in front of Robinson's Drugstore. He was met there by John Neal. Then Arthur Garfield Hayes said to Rabbi Mark, being the only Jew on the counsel for the defense, I want to meet the rabbi. Rabbi Mark then met Darrow. He says, Darrow, quote, impressed me as a man of sincerity, although he was fully conscious of his role in the drama and was self-centered enough to make the most of it. He said his impression of Brian, quote, was a great orator, a man with capacity for thinking, but circumscribed by past experiences as a politician and by his very sincere but narrow understanding of the Bible and religion. Tom Stewart, Rabbi Mark said he was, quote, uninspiring. No wonder that when he became U.S. Senator later, the Tennessee newspaper called him Me Too Stewart. What about Judge Ralston? Very small mental capacity or ability. We will hear more from Rabbi Mark next week when his reminiscences provide us some color commentary on one of the most entertaining episodes in the courtroom that I'm sure you've never heard about. Roz Shanzer, the granddaughter, also wrote to me that, quote, somewhere there's a third, she sent me a second document, somebody else from Knoxville from the congregation who had gone to the trial, who had H.L. Mencken type observations to make about what was going on. So Roz also wrote to me that, quote, somewhere there's a third, potentially more important letter in which my grandfather explained his role working with Clarence Darrow, but none of us have ever been able to find it. That's what she told me in 2019 when I was preparing this time around. I emailed her again and said, any chance, any luck, anybody found it? No such luck. Roz also added, She said, my mom and my grandparents always told us that Darrow originally sent a telegram to Hebrew Union College asking about finding a biblical scholar who could lend him a hand. And they telegraphed back, the HUC telegraphed back to say there was already an outstanding authority on the scene named Rabbi Jerome Mark. She says, as you and I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was also supposed to give an opening prayer one day during the trial. As it turned out, though, he never got the chance because he was asked to do it on a Friday, but he had to speak to his own congregation in Knoxville that evening instead. One last word about Rabbi Mark under the heading of how messy history can be. Rabbi Mark died in 1967. Roz sent me 2 newspaper obituaries and a 1963 article about his return to Knoxville after he retired from the rabbinate. All 3 articles refer to him as an expert witness at the trial, which he was not. One said, quote, to his surprise, he was called as an expert witness to give an interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, end quote. Well, to his surprise and to ours, because he wasn't. Neither Roz in her research nor I in mine have found any reference to Rabbi Mark being an expert or an interpreter of anything. When you join, as I hope you will, in my interview of historian Ed Larson, I have a high degree of confidence that he will comment on the phenomenon of writers who get their history of the trial by reading newspaper accounts. All right, back to legal business, kind of. Remember, the judge had under consideration a defense motion to dismiss the case. He now says in open court that he has a lengthy opinion that he has dictated. He gave it to a court reporter in secret. The judge, I have not intimated to any living soul what my opinion was, except to the stenographer. I am now informed that the newspapers in the large cities are being now sold, which undertake to state what my opinion is. Any person that sent out such information, I will deal with them as the law directs. The judge says, because of this, he's going to hold off announcing his decision until the next morning. He wants to meet with all members of the press. Dudley Field Malone, can we quickly dispose of the motion? Witnesses are on their way. The judge says he's working on it. That's the motion about the, I'm sorry, we're working on it. But now the judge meets with the press. And he says to the press, I have information, gentlemen, or all gentlemen, or at least men, that the newspapers are being sold in the eastern cities now, which undertake to state what my action was on the motion. The judge reads from a wire. Quote, the St. Louis Star, out final, carrying story. Law has been held constitutional by judge. So the judge appoints a committee of 5 newspaper men to investigate how the press was reporting this story. That was it for Thursday, July 14th, the 3rd day of the trial. 3 days of trial, 3 days almost entirely taken up with lawyers arguing. That night, the committee of 5 reporters met to figure out how one of their colleagues had written the article about the decision that had not yet been announced, the article that infuriated Judge Ralston. What did they figure out? How did they do it? That's for next week, when we will resume with day 4. I see that my inclination is correct, that we've got a chunk of time. I'm happy to entertain questions, comments, criticisms, words of praise, whatever the heart may prompt, as they say in the spirituality business, if people want to hang around for some Q&A. Judith, anything in the chat?
I have one comment from Brian Harrison, who wants us to know that Inherit the Wind is available for free on Prime Video if you have Prime Video.
Okay, available for free on Prime Video, Inherit the Wind. and there are a number of other streaming services where for a very modest fee you can get it. One thing that I edited out, but I'll take a moment to talk about because it seems to me it's kind of central to when I explain trials. In trials are about disputed facts and resolving facts. When the issue is purely an issue of law, that's generally resolved by a judge, and it's generally resolved on motion. Because if there are no disputed facts, there are all kinds of ways that lawyers have of presenting disputed issues of law to a judge that don't require witness testimony, because almost always witness testimony is about, here's what I saw, here's what I heard. And in this case, not only was there no dispute about the facts, as you heard me explain last week, each side had an interest in making sure that the facts didn't get before a jury, because the facts seemed pretty clear to be that Scopes did not teach evolution, but everybody had a vested interest in kind of blowing by that point. Right? This was a collusive lawsuit. The prosecution wanted a trial because they wanted the event in Dayton, and the defense wanted the trial because they wanted to get the issue up on appeal. So why are we having this trial? It doesn't mesh. And part of the answer is, you may recall I made a very brief reference last week to Darrow and the defense team going to federal court in Tennessee to try and get an injunction, a legal order to stop the prosecution on the theory that the law was unconstitutional. This was 1925. This is more legal stuff than you might have bargained for, but I want you to understand. Today in 2025, when we talk about issues of church and state and religion in the schools, we're talking about the First Amendment, which has two clauses: the Establishment Clause forbidding the establishment of religion, and the Free Exercise Clause enabling all of us to freely exercise our religious practices. But the First Amendment talks about Congress shall make no law. It's about federal government action. Well, what about the states? Are the states covered by the First Amendment? And the answer is now the states are, but it's only as a result of Supreme Court cases in 1940 with respect to the Free Exercise Clause and 1948 with respect to the Establishment Clause. Supreme Court said, yes, those prohibitions are now incorporated into the constitutional prohibitions that apply to the states. So in 1925, I haven't seen transcript of argument, if there is transcript, of what was argued before the federal judge asking the judge to stop the case. But what they could not have said is all of this federal stuff applies here to what the state of Tennessee is doing. What the defense could argue, and what they did argue before Judge Ralston, was it violates the state constitution. But the likelihood that Judge Ralston was going to tackle issues of what we would call in the law first impression, namely that hadn't been argued before, for all kinds of reasons. This was not the kind of issue Judge Ralston would have dealt with in the ordinary course of business. He had an interest in there being a very public trial as part of his re-election campaign the next year. So all of that goes into, I guess I'm, spoiler alert, the judge said, I don't think this law is unconstitutional, let's get on with it. But it would be a natural question to ask, if trials are about disputed facts and this is purely about the law, how do we even get to the point of having this 8-day trial? And the answer is, for a combination of the factors that I just laid out for you. Anything else? Judith?
Mal asks, of the hundreds who flocked into the courtroom, why do you think they were there? The spectacle, the famous lawyers, affirmation of their faith, it was something to do?
Well, you could all hear the question, right? Why were 700 people there? And I from everything I've read and had the benefit of talking to the people in Dayton, Tennessee who carry on these stories, I think it was all of that. I think Dayton and I'll talk some more about this in the last lecture because I want to share with you my observations about being in Dayton, Tennessee, where the legacy of this trial is a big deal. Dayton was not the typical evangelical community that one would have found elsewhere in Tennessee. There was actually some diversity of religious practice there, but there is no way to overstate the reverence and regard that many in the community in the surrounding area had for William Jennings Bryan. The man had run for president 3 times and lost. He'd been Secretary of State. He had published much and spoken all over the country, hundreds and hundreds of lectures. That's how he made his living at this point, talking about issues of fundamentalism and eventually about evolution. So for William Jennings Bryan to come to Dayton was no small thing. And then when Darrow signed on and volunteered his services, I mean, this was OLLI and Frazier. It wasn't like people could sit on Zoom and watch it. So it was that. And the people of Dayton, the George Rapelier crowd, they promoted it hard. You'll hear different comments about, how many people actually showed. Oh, we'll have 20,000 people on the lawn, is what the judge said. Well, 20,000 people didn't show up in Dayton, Tennessee, but the press was there big time. And it's a remarkable thing to think about 700 people showing up for a trial. Yes, the issues were important to a lot of people, and yeah, it was great theater. It was great theater. Naomi.
Thank you very much. I give you applause from all of us it's fascinating what you're doing. It's interesting that practically 100 years later, the same problem arose, this was very timely, that people who wanted to bring religion back, the whole idea of keeping God outside the schoolhouse, but when it got to the question of whose prayer, that's when things fell apart again, in the same way that you're describing. Because they were afraid they didn't want the other people's prayer to be introduced. So it was downright intolerance and nastiness that the civil war did.
All right, Naomi's commenting on, for the people at home, commenting on how, we have 100 years worth of these issues still, religion and science and what gets taught in the schools. And then the flare up over the prayer, I suppose, is because for many, that's what's at the heart of this. What runs throughout the transcript, this business about, this agnostic, and we haven't heard the last of that, to be sure, because wait till you hear what Clarence Darrow says about being called an agnostic. I suppose it's the pressure point for both sides or all sides. Anything else before we go? Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious about the Butler Act.
Yeah.
What year was that?
Well, it's 1925.
That was when the Butler Act
Yes.
was
Yes. Yeah, it was passed in the spring of 1925
Tennessee
in Tennessee. It was state law.
so evolution was already a hot topic.
Evolution was becoming a hot topic for a variety of reasons. Ed Larson, we'll talk about this in the interview with him, and his book is terrific on this point. But, Origin of Species was, I think I said 1859 or 69, 59. Thank you. We had, surrounded by authority here. For years, this was not an issue for fundamentalists, in part because the evolutionary biologists were people who said, well, yeah, no, God created all this kind of at the foundational level. But with the advent of, training of another generation or two of biologists, and then public schools, where this stuff was now, more students from more families were being exposed to this stuff. And that and the growth of the fundamentalist movement in 1920 with the publication of the Fundamentals, which is where the term fundamentalist comes from, and Bryan latching on to it, and many others, and talking about it all over the country. And again, this is rich in complexity. One of Bryan's concerns about evolution was he thought there was a connection, that there was something inevitable about teaching evolution and it leading people to embrace eugenics. And so part of the irony here is here's Bryan concerned about eugenics, and H.L. Mencken, who is widely accepted, not only was he a pro-eugenics guy, but a racist and anti-Semite. So if you're looking for simple, bright lines of, quote, good guys and, quote, bad guys, you won't find those bright lines here. But by 1925, the anti-evolution fever had been raised, and that's what gave rise to Tennessee passing the law. And it was such that the American Civil Liberties Union was on the lookout for these kinds of laws. And as I mentioned last week, during the First World War, the ACLU, which was a fledgling organization, they were primarily concerned with war-related issues, pacifists and the like. But with the war being over, their focus shifted to kind of unions and the schools and teachers. And that's why they saw this as a kind of free speech for teachers kind of issue.
So that shouldn't have been such a surprise that so many people came to watch that trial.
Well, I mean, there are all kinds of important issues that get litigated in court where 700 people don't show up. But I think it's the combination of it was the issues. It hits a lot of people in their heart, and again, people show up for a good prize fight, and OLLI versus Frazier is a good prize fight, and Bryan and Darrell, because they had been circling each other for several years. A couple of years earlier, Darrow had published a piece in a Chicago newspaper with the questions that he wanted Bryan to answer. And Bryan said something to the effect of, I'll answer his questions when he answers mine. So they had been circling each other. This was not out of left field that they would be the primary, in some sense, the primary antagonists here.
I don't know if this question is for like a bigger class on the Constitution.
Or a smarter instructor, yes, but go ahead.
I was, brought up like all of us here, that there's a separation of church and state. First Amendment is clear as a bell. How can it be that year after year, these cases come up about wanting to put the Ten Commandments in a church? How do these cases even exist? That I don't understand. Can the state constitution be at variance with the federal constitution?
All right. Have you got another 3 or 4 hours?
That's what I was wondering.
So let me give you a Reader's Digest version of an answer, and I'm saying it's an answer. It's my answer. It's my view. I'm sure is shared by many, and of course there are plenty who have a very different point of view on this. But you're touching on the frustration of those of us who are members of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, right? So to us, we say, let's start with the Constitution. I mentioned the First Amendment has 2 clauses. The Establishment Clause. We can't establish the town of Great Barrington cannot establish a church, right? By the way, Massachusetts used to establish churches. They're all over the state of Massachusetts. You'll find historic church buildings. In this town, this was the established church. And we don't do that anymore, right? That's the establishment of religion. Then we have the Free Exercise Clause. I have the right to worship where I want to worship. The government can't tell me to do it, not do it. And in the mix is government cannot prefer one religion to another, and it cannot prefer religion to non-religion, okay? What's happened over the years, this is editorial comment, is the fundamentalist and evangelical community, and by the way, that is not limited to the Christian community, although primarily, but Judaism has its fundamentalists as well. That crowd has succeeded in getting courts, and particularly this Supreme Court, to take, in what is my view, a far too broad a view of what the free exercise of religion is, to the point of diminishing, if not almost extinguishing, the protections of the Establishment Clause. So, for example, when it comes to using public funds in schools, in public schools, it used to be that the use of public funds in public schools was prohibited, then it became permitted, and we are on the verge of a Supreme Court saying it's required. How does this happen? And it happens because the argument is made that when you make public funds available to these schools, but you don't allow religious schools to use those funds, that's discrimination against religion. That's the argument. We can argue on another occasion the pros and cons of that. I don't buy that argument for all kinds of reasons, but that's the argument that gets made, that when you deny public funds to a church or a religious organization doing a religious mission, you are discriminating against religion. And that's why that point of view is in the ascendancy, because we have a Supreme Court that is quite amicable to that point of view, and those of us who are arguing the other side of that lose. Well, there are a lot of arguments. The point being made is, if the free exercise crowd wants to be quite that free, then all kinds of arguments flow from that. There are all kinds of laws that religious organizations are not subject to. A church is not subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Why? Because we don't want the government interfering more than is absolutely necessary with the governing of religious institutions. So we don't want the government telling a church who they can hire or not hire. Well, but this person has a disability, you can accommodate them. We don't want government involved in that kind of detail of religious organizations, because we want the government to be out of that business. We don't have real estate taxes on church property, because we don't want the government to be able to say, well, we don't like what you did last year in your church, so we're going to raise those taxes. That's the concern that is behind saying, let's just stay out of that business. So, the argument is made by me and others, it's great to stay out of the business of active houses of worship, but when it comes to the flip side of that, which is, we're not going to spend public money on active houses of worship. Well, but we want that public money, say the churches. Fine, but you typically don't want what goes along with it, which is the public scrutiny of what you do in that church. And I'm the first one to say, I don't want to be in the position of scrutinizing what churches and other houses of worship do, because I think there should be a separation. And I'm willing to tolerate whatever the excesses may be as the price to pay for staying out of the business of churches. Anyway, no, it's a very rich question. Yes, sorry.
Yes, I live on the common in Pittsfield, and now I see churches coming in and having a service in the park, and I really object to it, but I'm told that's what's happening.
Yeah, the question is from a class member who lives in Pittsfield and sees church services held on a public area in Pittsfield. So my quick Reader's Digest response, of course, paints in broad strokes. There's a limitless, seemingly limitless number of kinds of questions that come up when you attempt to apply the Establishment Clause and make it make sense with the Free Exercise Clause. So, should a religious group be able to use a public space in Great Barrington? And we get into questions of, well, is the space being used by other groups? Because there is, at some point, concern about showing hostility to religion as opposed to non-religion. Then there are questions that come up about whether the use of the public resource suggests some kind of endorsement by the government. And my bet, unencumbered by knowing the facts of the situation you describe, is that the analysis says, having a worship service in the park, it doesn't alter, a life in Pittsfield for those who are non-worshipers. It's not the same as the city of Pittsfield putting up a sign across City Hall that says, read your Bible. Right? But these are things that they can be sliced very thinly. And organizations like Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and many organizations on the other side of these issues, they fight all the time about where to draw these lines. For many issues, I'd be quick to say, if anybody tells you it's simple, they're not paying attention. We're at 11 o'clock. I'm delighted we had the chance for this. Hope to see you all one way or another next week. Thank you. Thank you.